Welcome to the Social Mobility Talks podcast, brought to you by the Social Mobility Commission and hosted by me, Alun Francis, Chair of the SMC. The SMC publishes research on social mobility, and we use this to provide advice to government. We also work to promote social mobility by collaborating with and challenging employers, professionals, universities, schools, families and other organisations to play their part. Today's episode is about early years interventions, with a particular focus on Sure Start. Evidence that early years plays a special role in shaping future lifetime opportunities is very strong, both in terms of the development of cognitive skills and non-cognitive skills. But we have less of a consensus about how best to do this. We looked at the evidence around parenting in an earlier report last year, and we've produced a new report, which is being published now, which is a rapid evidence review looking at 47 family and parenting programs worldwide. This is quite a small sample of the total number, but we focused on those with the best evidence. And having done that, it's still not absolutely clear about which of those interventions is particularly most effective in terms of educational achievement and the skills development of young children. This is very important because what we want to be able to recommend is effective interventions which we know have an impact. And to explore this challenge, looking at Sure Start is a particularly good example. By far the largest intervention in the UK from 1998 to 2010. Its aim was to give children the best start in life. It had a significant amount of investment to grow a large number of children's centres across the country. And we're here to help explore the story of Sure Start. And I'm thrilled to say that we have with us Naomi Eisenstadt, who's travelled all the way up to Manchester to meet us to discuss this. And Naomi was the first director of the Sure Start programme. Naomi, welcome.
Thank you very much.
And tell us a little bit about the setting up of Sure Start, what it was trying to achieve, and some of the challenges involved in that.
I think you have to see the beginnings of Sure Start in the context of 1997 and the new Labour government. And I think without that context, so one of the big differences in the government in 1997 was the sharing of social policy between Number 10 and the Treasury. So up until then, the Treasury basically gave the money out, but didn't define what it should be doing, what government department should do. But through a deal that Blair and Brown made, the Treasury had a big influence, a big controlling role on social policy as well as economic policy. The other thing that New Labour was really interesting was cross-government working. So it was all about joined up government, and wouldn't it be better if we looked at joint problems and solved them together, and complex problems require joined up solutions, all that kind of stuff. And they were really interested in child poverty. And I think part of the interest in child poverty was about the deserving rather than the undeserving poor. So it's not the child's fault, but also the work that, again, Treasury led by the sadly departed Norman Glass, a senior civil servant at the Treasury, who led a comprehensive cross-government review on services for young children and found fundamentally what you just said, Alan, that poor children do less well than their better off peers, and that this gap can be mitigated by family support services and services aimed at young children. And as a result of that review, Sure Start was born. And I was lucky enough to get the job to head it up.
So what was the distinctively different feature of Sure Start as a concept that would address the problem you've described in a way that hadn't been done before?
Well, in fairness, it's not correct to say it hadn't been done before, in the sense that there were some very, very good family centres, children's centres around the country that Norman Glass went to visit and gave him his Corm family in London and Pen Green in Corby and Hillfields in Coventry, and I can't remember the name of the one, there was a really good one in Manchester as well, where they were open access, often run by charities and by voluntary sector, but some run by local government, usually funded by local government, if not run by local government, which brought together a range of services, a one-stop shop, and had a range of open access services that anyone in the community, in the locality, could use, where it wasn't particularly targeted by family and particular problems. So they were non-stigmatizing. Sometimes there were referrals, but that also mixed with families who didn't have any particular problems, but loved the social aspects, loved having a place to come with their children. They offered benefits advice, they offered health advice, they offered stay and play, they offered a range of services in one place. And Norman looked at the research, looked at the whole drive towards joined-up government and thought, aha, this is what we should do for young children. At the same time, the 1997 manifesto promised a national child care strategy and separately promised free early education for 4-year-olds. So there were three things going on, three policy areas going on, oddly enough, not joined up, that New Labour was interested in. One was childcare to get more women into employment, particularly lone parents. One was early education, nursery education, and the third was integrated services. So that was kind of the context. So it was happening, but it was happening in patches. And what he saw that he liked, he said, aha, let's put that together into a program.
Great, thank you. So those three elements of the program in an integrated package are one of the kind of defining features. But is another defining feature the scale of it. So you're brought in as the first director, but this is the investment, the level of investment, the number of centres is much, much bigger than we've seen before.
It was massive. We started out, there were some very distinctive features that are important in terms of government program. One was there were lots of area-based initiatives at the time. There were education action zones, there were health action zones, there was New Deal for communities. This was aimed at micro-communities. So it was based in the poorest neighborhoods in England, and Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland had their own version, so I need to make it clear I'm only talking for England. We started out with the original funding was 450 million over 3 years for 250 Sure Start local programs to be based in the poorest neighborhoods in England. And a local program would cover between 600 and 800 children under 4 in what we called pram pushing distance. So you could walk to the center. You know, it's sort of like primary schools, but so it was very, very local. Another very distinguishing feature was that a committee was set up by providers of children's services in that locality, which included the local school and the voluntary sector, but also local parents. So it was required to have local parents on the committee. So what would be offered in that center, aside from some essential features like additional play and childcare and health advice and parenting advice, was, so what do you think you need? You know, a very strong negotiation. So there was a huge difference in the governance of it at micro level, but also the governance at government level was very different in the sense that my direct report was to Tessa Jowell, who was a minister in the Department of Health, but the cabinet level responsibility for Sure Start was David Blunkett, who was the Secretary of State for Education. And there was a big debate about, so what do we do about question time? If there's questions about Sure Start, is it in education time or is it in health time? I was new to the civil service. I'd come in from the voluntary sector. I thought this was a very strange question. Who cares? Does this help children? But in fact, it was very important because it gave civil servants the signal that this is going to be different. So my, sort of sniffing at, who cares about all this? I was completely wrong. It was really important.
So it's a very ambitious program.
It
involves building buildings,
yep.
Bespoke designed buildings, building teams,
yep.
building structures and partnerships that you described. Tell us a bit about some of the challenges in setting up a program of that size and scale, and how do you get the consistency, and how do you ensure that you're able, in every area, you're getting the kind of same kind of approach?
Well, that was one of the key arguments with the academics, because we weren't looking for consistency or sameness. We were looking, again, a feature of modernizing government was outcomes, not inputs. So we had our own public service agreement with defined outcomes that however you want to do it in your locality, do what works for you, because it was respecting local context. So the consistency was in the primary aims of fewer low birth weight children, fewer admissions to hospital in the first year due to, it wasn't about non-accidental, it was very much about things that are poverty related, like bronchial problems and infections. So all those things that make it harder if you're in a poor neighborhood. So there was clear consistency in the aims we were looking for, but not consistency in the way it was delivered. And some of them were very different. So there's not that many different things you can do with a 2-year-old. But the sense of local ownership was very important in the culture of Sure Start. So if I go back to the question you asked me about what were the difficulties, there were difficulties where we absolutely didn't anticipate how hard it would be. So one of them was, as you say, capital. So they had those first 250 and then became 500, had a very generous capital allocation, up to £1 million per program for capital. Well, people who work in early years are not commissioners of £1 million buildings. So it took a year just to decide what we want to build, where we can get planning permission to do it, what's already there. So that took much longer than we anticipated. Obviously, recruiting staff took much longer than we anticipated. Spending the money, and this is again how green I was. I had come in from the voluntary sector. I didn't know you had to spend the money in a year. So the first year, my budget was 80 million and we spent 6. And of course, the Treasury was furious, and no, I'm not going to say that. Anyway, it was very difficult. But my view was every area that was designated, it wasn't a competition. If you were poor enough, you got the money based on an agreed plan. And just doing the planning was very difficult. So we wouldn't release the money till we were satisfied that the plan was good enough, and that took much longer. And there's a really funny story about the planning. We had a test for whether they spoke to local parents or not. So if they said we spoke to local parents and they said that we want more health visitors and speech therapists, we knew they spoke to health visitors and speech therapists. If they spoke to local parents and the local parents said, we're worried about the dog dirt in the park, we're worried about broken glass, we're worried. These were very, very poor neighborhoods. They were very unpleasant places, and they were scary places. So what the parents wanted largely was about improving the local environment. You know, they didn't, nobody asked for a parenting program, believe me. Nobody asked for Webster Stratton. So that's why working with local people was so important. So that was one of the challenges, is how long it takes to decide what to do, how long it takes to build a building. The other big challenge is that we didn't pay enough attention to the training needs of local managers in particular. So one of the things that we were trying to do wasn't just a new service, was how do you make the services already in place join up and work better together? How do you get real interagency working at neighborhood level, at a very granular level? Well, people working in early years don't command that kind of respect. So a head teacher would not have the same respect for, let's say, someone who's running a nursery as they would for a local pediatrician. So for someone running the local program to have the kind of local esteem that can pull together the key partners, that was very difficult. Some of it worked brilliantly, some of it didn't. But these are the kinds of things that we didn't anticipate.
Really interesting. And can I ask you just a little bit more, we'll move on in a second, but on this issue about, so we started off with a program that had kind of 3 kind of policy imperatives, which you described earlier, but then it's balanced against this notion of local engagement. So how far is there a tension between those two things? And does that mean there's a danger at times of the program losing its focus a bit? How did you manage that?
I think that it's much more of a balance of what you're trying to do, and I think that we lost focus on the child. I think there was too much about the parents, and one of the lines I used to say is that I think that the Department of Education didn't really understand that any early years service, childcare or nursery education or whatever, is voluntary. If you don't send your kids to school, you're in trouble. but you don't have to use a local community-based service. So unless you do something that local people want to use, it's not going to work. Just because if they don't like it, they won't come. Just because they like it, it doesn't mean it helps their kids. And the interesting thing is that, I mean, I've worked on local estates. I know how hard it is. What happens is you get completely seduced by the families that love you. And you're really busy. And they love you and tell you, this changed my life, it's the best thing that ever happened to me. Ministers come and visit, and they tell the minister it's the best thing that ever happened to me. So everybody thinks it's great. Until you get the evaluation results that say, actually, it's not that great. Because it was very hard to get the data on who wasn't coming. And until we did the hard, granular work on who wasn't coming and why we were failing. The families who didn't come to begin with, and then you need to do a lot of what I call assertive outreach. So they don't have to come, it's not social services, it's not mandated, but it's doing the home visit and doing the home visit again and knocking on the door and saying, I'll come and introduce you to people. And that did work. I mean, the evaluation results changed, and we did get better as we went along, and not learning on getting better, but that business about the most willing take up all your time, and because they tell you you're doing a great job, you think you are. And of course you are, I'm not being cynical about it, but it's human nature.
I think that's such an important point. When this program started, I worked in area-based regeneration in East Manchester, and Sure Start was one of a number of initiatives there. You described some of them. And I would say anecdotally that tension between the willing and the ones who loved it and the ones who weren't necessarily engaging was quite marked. And it's a real difficulty. I suspect it's still around now. We might come back to that. What I want to just move on to then, before we go into some of the strengths and weaknesses of Sure Start and what the evaluations told us is, was there consistency from ministers about what they expected from Sure?
No, of course not. We had a ministerial oversight committee, a steering group, and the reason I wrote my book about Sure Start was that each minister had a different think bubble about what they wanted from it, and my job was to please everybody, and that wasn't easy. Let me just, Tessa Jowell wanted to smell the babies, David Blunkett didn't want a Soviet-style nursery with cots lined up, but he did want a great community involvement. He wanted community participation. Margaret Hodge wanted early education. I'm trying to think of who else. Those were the sort of three key players that made my life really interesting.
And as this was expanding...
and Yvette Cooper wanted childcare for working mothers.
Okay. And then driving that is Gordon Brown, who's overseeing the Treasury, who's expanding the programme, but it has kind of different iterations as it goes along. So it starts off with the local Short Start programmes, then we move to a more universal offer. So what was the kind of Treasury view? What was the Treasury expected to get back for their return on investment?
Okay, so if I talk about the very early days, and this is where it can't get better if you're a civil servant, is Gordon Brown and Tony Blair were fighting for the credit. So they kept upping the game because they both wanted credit for it, because it was very, very popular. I remember a set of parents from Newcastle telling me that it was the first time they voted. And I found that really moving. It still makes me, incredibly proud. It's astonishing, really. Jack Straw told me that in his constituents just didn't think it was a government program. They assumed it was a voluntary organization because it was so nice. And one thing I want to say that I don't mean to sound defensive is that if you look at the analysis that Jacqueline Barnes did in that first phase of who the users were, they were very poor. There was nothing about middle class. These were very, very poor families. There were, among those very poor families, some that were harder to reach than others, but the ones who were coming forward definitely needed this kind of service and were benefiting from it. So I do think that's important to say. In terms of the difficulty, and this is an irony that I always sort of ponder on, is that its popularity virtually killed it, because it became so popular. every MP wanted it in their constituency, and that meant moving to some quite wealthy. So the demand for it to expand to everybody rather than just poor areas meant that by 2004 there was a decision to have a Sure Start Children's Center, not a local program. Local programs are out. We will call them children's centers now around the building in every neighborhood, 2,500 altogether, all over England. But that meant that the money was spread more thinly. And if you spread the money more thinly, those neighborhoods that needed it more. And under Labour, we still had disproportionate funding for the poorest areas. But when basically post the crash and during the coalition, they wanted to even out the funding, which meant that the poorest areas got less money, so you could build it up in the wealthy areas. I mean, these weren't wealthy areas, they just were not the poorest areas. So that expansion, on the one hand, meant that the original purpose was significantly diluted. On the other hand, it created a public recognition everywhere of Sure Start that was astonishing. So when they started being cut back, my best story was David Cameron's mother being on the picket line to maintain their local Sure Start Center. They still shut it, but still, it says something about cross-party support.
Well, I certainly didn't know that. So shall we move on then to a bit more detail on the kind of strengths and weaknesses? So we've done a really good job, I think, of talking through the setup and some of the tensions and some of the issues to manage there. But tell us, in terms of the evaluations, what emerges as the strengths of the Sure Start programme?
I mean, the main benefits in terms of the evaluation there's two big evaluations. There was national value of Sure Start and then the evaluation of children's centres in England. And both of them, after a number of years, found real benefits for parents. Better home learning environment, less home chaos, higher employment rate, so people did go back to work in Sure Start areas than non-Sure Start areas. There was almost no difference in children. And part of that is because by then we had universal nursery education. So you weren't comparing something, the evening up of virtually all 3 and 4-year-olds being in some sort of early years group provision, in addition to a community-based center, meant that we weren't getting it. We never got from Sure Start cognitive gains. We got gains, and one of the questions that I've always asked myself, and that nobody's done the research on it, was that even on the improvements in home learning environment and the improvements in parenting, I hate it as a verb, but still it's what we do now, but the improvements in that, did it come through in terms of a next baby?
Just explain what you mean.
Well, so you're part of this group and you're learning all these new things and you're finding it really interesting, and yes, there's evidence that your home learning environment is improving, which we know has a direct relationship with good child outcomes. But if that took 18 months or 2 years, the kid's in school already. Did you have another baby? Did the new baby benefit from those improvements? We've never been able to test that, but I've always been, maybe I'm too optimistic, I've always been curious about that. But I do think that the emphasis on community development, community participation, was too weighted in terms of what's actually good for the child. And I think that balance between being prescriptive and being supportive, this sort of community thing about the parents know their child best and all that kind of stuff, I think our balance was slightly wrong. But I wouldn't want it to go too far the other way, because I don't think if telling people what to do worked, it'd be fine. And I know what to do, but I know telling them what to do doesn't work.
That, from our point of view at the Commission, that's really getting to the nub of the issue, because our concern about early years policy is this really sharp focus, so there might be lots of justifications for lots of other interventions, but from a social mobility point of view, we want to focus on those that make that difference in terms of the child's cognitive and non-cognitive development. And it feels like that tension runs through Sure Start. So I think you mentioned Norman Glass earlier. I think there's a report he does around 2005 saying, well, look, we're losing the focus on child development because of the growth of the focus on getting parents back to work and childcare, for example. And that feels like that's a tension that still runs through early years policy now.
Absolutely. Well, if only our focus was child development, it isn't, it's child care, which is for employment purposes, and all the expansion recently described is completely about employment. It's not, and the difficult, it would be okay if that employment actually resulted in less poverty. But of course, now we have more children living in poverty where somebody is working in the household than not working. So we kind of lost both ways. I don't think Norman said about focus on child development. Norman said about focus on poor areas and the focus on child care. Norman and David Blunkett both were trying to keeping child care as a separate story. You know, not, so I think that's quite important. But there's still a tension, and it really depends on what you're trying to do. The best evidence for improved cognitive and non-cognitive skills is high-quality early education. Kathy Silva says this, Iram Siraj says this, all the people who really know, you know, in terms of 40 years of evidence in terms of children doing well at school, high-quality early education is what you would do. Now, that doesn't mean that you couldn't combine that with a range of other things. The tension is slightly different from the Sure Start difficulty, which was largely people who were at home. The tension is between flexible childcare, so that if a mother wants to work part-time 2 or 3 days a week, long days, and that's your free hours, you're not going to get the same cognitive gain as 5 half days in high-quality nursery school or nursery class.
So the focus on child development was part of the original remit.
Yes.
But I think what you're saying is there's a whole range of other factors in there from Sure Start's point of view, and perhaps that gets diluted a bit. Would that be a fair description?
Too many aims. You know, and in fact, when I was advising the lottery on their big early years program, which, you know, is minuscule compared to Sure Start, but they did their big early years program, which was very good, I encouraged them to have one aim, and that was language development, because it's my view and Ted Mellish's view, and other, you know, the most important thing is language development, and language development comes very early, and I don't think that we have a good description of even what a 2-year-old curriculum should be, let alone, you know, now 9 months.
Okay, it's interesting. So let's just talk a little bit about then lessons learned from Sure Start and where we think we've gone since kind of 2014, I suppose. So from that point, we see a decline in the number of Sure Start centres from earlier than that, 2010, 2014. So what do you think the lessons that we ought to have learned are, and what do you think the lessons that we actually have learned are?
The lessons that the lessons that I learned are that it's harder than you think and takes longer than you think, and you need clarity of goals, and that you can't kill 3 birds with 1 stone. But I think that's a lesson of government policy anyway, because politicians will always want to kill, you know, and rightly so in terms of the tax pound. So it's not a cynical comment, it's one that is natural in the policy arena. The second lesson is that these things are very, very hard to evaluate, and you get some surprises, good and bad. So our bad surprise was that initial evaluation, which found out that it's not that Sure Start wasn't working for teen mothers, it's that Sure Start was doing harm to teen mothers. Our first evaluation found that teen mothers were doing less well in Sure Start areas than non-Sure Start areas. Now we fixed that, and in the next wave of evaluation, it was all evened out, it was okay. But had we not done that kind of detailed evaluation, we wouldn't have even known it. So the idea that evaluation is just to prove how good a policy is, you need to absolutely make sure you're paying attention to what doesn't work, as well as what does work, and try to figure out why. Other lessons, you know, it takes a long time. People need much more training and support than we offered. And clarity on goals is really important. And that the evidence-based programs, I have a difficulty these days with programs, in the sense that we need to train people to understand what are the key features that create good practice and build it into the way they work, and not assume that manualized programs work. I'm not a fan of parenting programs, in part because they're great for the willing, but the dropout rate is massive. And it's almost by definition, if you're willing, then you're motivated to change anyway. So the people who need it, my joke again about parenting programs is always, put them in a free laundrette and I'll be there. If they're within the context of people's bandwidth and the stress that people are under in terms of their day-to-day lives, but if you're worried about paying the electric bill, if your washing machine breaks down and you have no money to fix the washing machine, your main issue is not going to be parenting programs. Your main issue is getting the washing machine fixed. So I think the context of the way people live their lives has to be built into the way that we design these programs.
That's really interesting. We've actually got a piece of work that we've commissioned around looking at nudge and kind of behaviour techniques around engaging parents in programs, working with a number of voluntary sector organisations and others in different settings, particularly different kind of levelling up areas across the country. And that's due to come out sometime next year. And it'll be interesting because I think it's exactly getting to that issue that you're talking about. It feels very often when we've been out to visit projects, you can see really good work taking place, but the willing are the ones who are at the forefront. And you're always asking the question, but actually, in terms of the children who we most need to give attention to in terms of closing that gap, are they the ones that everybody's working with? And you've constantly got a question mark about whether we've got that quite right. I think it's also interesting to say there's different techniques, so home visits, group work. I'm with you on the parenting programs. When you talk about manualized programs, can we just be explicit for our listeners? You mean programs which almost issue a manual about how the intervention should take place, which then becomes rather ineffective in the sense that you're giving people a kind of instructional guide as to how to make interventions, when in fact context and situation are all important. So what would be better than a manualized approach?
Well, the tension is between the beauty of a manualized approach that is delivered with fidelity is that you can test it with a randomized controlled trial. And as soon as you vary what the input is, your RCT isn't valid. So I don't think that a manualized program is a bad thing. I think you use it to test out the basic concepts and do the RCT and see if it works and try to figure out which bits works, which didn't, and then try to incorporate those lessons into practice. But that's a very, very long-term project. But I also think that I love nudge stuff. I think it's really great. I don't feel manipulated or I don't feel abused. I just think anything that's going to give me the ability to do the things that are probably the right things to do, I have no problem with that, without coercion. So that's why I say about the free laundrette.
So we'll watch out for that report. But let me ask you one last bit then around this issue about kind of manualized approaches and so on, because this has quite a lot of implications for the training of the workforce. And I think it's really clear from everything that we've published on early years, but also other work, what works, etc., is that the early years workforce is incredibly important. There are proposals that to professionalise the early years workforce, make it a graduate workforce. Is that the answer? And how do we ensure that the early years workforce has the skill set necessary to make the interventions that you've been describing in an effective way?
More. I mean, I don't think it has to be a fully graduate workforce, but I think that you do need graduates, I think, in each room or what. Let's talk about group childcare first. But the difficulty is when you look at the evidence on early education that worked, it was basically 4 or 5 half days. It wasn't, random, which day you come, which day you don't come. Are they the same kids? Does the staff know all the children? How do you have a curriculum if different groups of children, different individual children are coming on different days? So there's the issue about what the offer is and how it's used. There's the issue about the training of the staff. There's particularly the issue for me about training of staff for under 3s, because I don't think I'm not aware of any good training for under threes. So I think that it's really, really important not to think that graduate means teacher. I think for 3 and 4-year-olds, it definitely does mean teacher. But I think that you need a mix. And you're not going to solve the workforce problem without better wages, because if you make higher entry barriers and keep the wages the same, nobody's going to come. I mean, we already have very high, part of quality is reducing turnover, is consistency of staff. We already have very high turnover. I mean, you will know in FE that there's, it's hair or care.
So let me ask you then about something we discussed earlier, which is 0 to 1s. So tell me, what you think in terms of the best. So 0 to 1 is absolutely so crucial in terms of developing early child development. Yeah. And of course, by the time a child reaches an early years workforce, they're actually quite well developed already. So what can we do to improve outcomes for children 0 to 1?
Okay, so my main ally in this is Andrea Leadsom, who managed to get money out of the Treasury for pregnant women and babies, for community-based family hubs that concentrate on that very, very early period. And one of Andrea's ideas that's absolutely brilliant is that you register your baby at the center. So immediately when you have your infant, you have to go to this place and you see all these other services available and all that kind of stuff. For the poorest families, I think this is really, really important. It is my view, and I'm going to be very careful about this because I was just speaking to my friend Jane Walfogel about just give me the evidence, I'm dying for the evidence. So right now I will say it is my view that we should have a protected first year. I think that we should have 12 months paid maternity leave, not 9 months as we currently have. I don't think, there is evidence that group care for under ones can have some bad impact on behavior later on. For a small number, it's not a high number, but a small number in a primary class of 3 difficult boys affects the whole class. But I also think, I just think domestic care is better for babies than group care. I'm not saying that men and women who choose to go to work, if they choose, they should use a childminder or a nanny. Nobody complains about nannies. Why? Because that's what rich people do. We never complain about how rich people raise their children. So, but I do think domestic settings, and even in terms of hygiene, domestic settings, why do we sterilize bottles? Why do we sterilize, babies together in terms of infection? It's not safe. So I do think domestic care is better for under ones. And I would like to see, rather than having free child care from 9 months onwards, 30 hours a week, I'd rather see, I'm sure that it would cost a lot more money, but 1 year paid parental leave, divided between mother and father as they choose. I don't think it has to be the mother, although I'll be really controlling and say, for the first 6 months, it's better if it's the mother so she can breastfeed.
I'm going to throw in one last question, and it's a quick yes-no one. So one thing we do know is that the early years attainment gap has narrowed until COVID, and it's widening again. We'll have to see what the pattern is as COVID settles out. But one of the things that has also changed alongside that is the educational attainment of parents. So I think it's gone from 30% of children, roughly 30% of children had graduate parents in 2010. It's now 40-something percent. It's quite a significant change. I might have the stats slightly wrong, I'm doing them from memory. But isn't one of the strategies for improving early years outcomes to improve the educational standards or achievement of parents? Isn't that something that we should take very seriously?
We should take seriously improving education for everybody, whether they're parents or not. And I do, because my NHS work now brings me into contact with a lot of the issues of the older population, and I'm one of them myself, I do think that we shouldn't be pitting generations against each other. That I think the early years is important, but I also think never too early, never too late. And I think that factor about more graduates, maybe that's why the gap might be narrowing, who knows. But yeah, I think that we need a life cycle approach to prevention and early intervention. Graham Allen used to make fun of me because I talked about falls prevention for the elderly. In terms of cash savings, it's the best cash savings of any early intervention because how expensive it is when an old person falls over and winds up in hospital. So I think that you need a life cycle approach to early intervention and prevention, and I don't think we pit one generation against the other.
Naomi, thank you very much indeed. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you.
I really enjoyed it too. Thank you.